All right, everybody, we are back again for another episode of the Coach's Compass. Episode I don't even know because we just been rolling through, bringing on guests from all over the world to continue to help this thing grow. Right, so remember, hit that like, subscribe, comment button down below so again, we can continue to help this thing go in the right direction. It's your boy, Coach Coop. My boy Jay, reporting live all the way from Europe. We got another special guest with us, and this one is reporting live from us all the way from America. We got the GOAT, a guy that's been in the industry for 30 plus years, Troy Jones out of Fort Lauderdale. Once was at House of Athlete, now currently coaching and running Symmetry Performance in Fort Lauderdale, has trained multiple NFL, CFL, college, high school, and youth athletes, also working with Lila, a new technology, a wearable resistance, which we will dive more into later because we definitely want to hear all about that. But also knows our boy Dion, who is currently playing with Jay in Fehérvár with the Enthroners. Also, big connection with CeCe Murray, who we had on earlier, Sam Portman. So that just goes to show you that this guy has a lot of knowledge to drop for us. So, Coach, thank you for coming on today and welcome to the Coach's Compass.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me, man. I'm grateful. I'm honored.
Coach, first off, how are you doing, man? Like, how's life for Coach Troy?
Life is busy. That's a great question. A lot of travel, a lot of experiences. Had opportunity to travel around the world, training athletes and seeing different cultures, and just being able to share my experiences with those cultures on how I approach sports, and how I begin to try to. My goal has always been to create the ultimate athlete. That's my theme. I stick to that. That keeps me balanced. That keeps me grounded. Just sharing some of my success stories on how I've done things, and how to avoid some of the pitfalls that I've come across over that period of time. And people seem to be interested, and they listen, and it kind of works out from there.
What is Coach Troy doing in this industry that's setting him apart from the rest and bringing you so much success?
I would say attention to detail. I'm big on finding the root cause of issues before I jump in with just trying to developing a program. I want to know the why behind everything and why it works in regards to what's impacting that athlete, what's causing that athlete not to perform at the level they desire to, and then go through a whole, I would say, scenario from the ground up of trying to reprogram or just readjust and fix those issues. So I can say less in real time when I'm coaching, because I think a lot of times we don't have the right plan in place to approach problem solving when it comes down to training. And I think that's what's made it unique for me, because I just look at everybody as an individual, and then I figure out where they are in their stage of development, and then I go from there.
Where was that learned from? Like, how did you know to like figure out the why, and then also pay so much attention beforehand? So like when you get to training, there's less time spent talking and more in the training aspect.
I think it began with, like I said, it goes back to that creating the ultimate athlete concept. I looked at earlier in my career that training, how does that apply to what we do on the field? Because at the end of the day, it has to be transferable. And you can be the best weight room guy and still not be the best athlete on the field. How are we impacting those variables that's going to have you playing each and every day, and then not only playing every day and performing at a high level, just being available overall and healthy? Because if you feel good, you're going to play good. Metrics matter, but metrics don't tell the entire story, because sometimes the best athlete ain't on the field playing. And we learned that years and years ago from a cognitive standpoint, that the brain matters. Confidence matters. Understanding what your issues so you can develop the daily routine matters. Just to stay healthy, just to be able to get to have your process in place of when you play, how you recover, and how do you prepare for the next day to be able to do it again. Can you duplicate this over and over again, depending on what your calendar is within your season? All these things matter. And that's how professional athletes make money. But if you can install those type of disciplines in a younger athlete and begin to show them early on what that process is, you have a better opportunity to play at a higher level for a long time. Let's say it was trial and error. Really, just making a lot of mistakes over the course of those years and then figuring out what not to do versus making notes on what to do and then sticking to those things that were simple and it was effective.
Completely agree with that. What is the process? You know what I mean? Because like that's a huge question. Like a lot of people are trying to figure out like how to. I mean, parents, they're trying to figure out how do I make my youth athlete into, a professional athlete. Some parents want it more than what the kid wants it, but like, what does that process look like taking a youth athlete all the way to the professional level?
It goes back to meeting them where they are and understanding what stage of development they're in. Early on, I know there's a lot of cliches out there from an education standpoint of what stages of athletes, what they go through in development. That early stage of not giving too much of a stimulus too soon. And understanding when you have to introduce the athlete to the environment and not oversaturate them with information. Because their brains, when they're very young, aren't really ready to receive a ton of information. But the environment plays a major role. So introducing them to just basic fundamental movement patterns. We call that a learning to train phase. And when you introduce them to that phase, you have to understand the time that you introduce them to the stimulus matters, what type of stimulus matters, and then keep it simple. Do one thing and do one thing really well before you move to the next thing. And you just build on it and layer it because you go from a learn to train, a training to train, a training to compete, then a training to win. That learn to train phase is, I would say, elementary school. And this is how it worked for me when I began to look at it. So my programming for my youth athletes was slightly different from my train to train, which is just an introduction to fundamental movement patterns and prepping the athlete to start understanding what weight training is about. And then that training to train aspect, when you come out to learn to train, that training to compete, that's that early high school, late middle school, depending on the maturity of the athlete and when they were introduced to training, because that matters too. That gets them now using training to move well as an athlete. And then that training to compete phase is a phase of now you understand what sport you play and you're starting to prepare and train for that sport. Training to win is more of now you've identified the position within the sport. You've taken it even a step deeper. So now you're specifically, let's say football, you're training as a DB versus you're training as a football and a player overall and playing multiple positions in that training to compete phase. So you become more specific as you progress further into your training cycle over the course of years because your brain is a little bit more mature where it can digest information in regards to being very strategic to how you approach it. So if you can't force feed a young athlete and have them do things they're just not mentally and physically ready for. So understanding that you get a better adaptation at that age if you understand how to break it down and micro progress.
How are you breaking it down and micro progressing for these guys? You talk about movement patterns and all that stuff. What even are movement? Because a lot of listeners and a lot of coaches out there still don't fully understand movement patterns, the movement maps. How are you breaking all that down and getting that to transfer over to these youth kids and then going through as they mature?
I think you asked me a question earlier. It was you said, I'm going to go back to that question. You asked me, how do I really approach it? And I guess the big scope of things is overall movement and body control for a young athlete at the very, very beginning. Most young athletes, what do they lack at certain stages of development? That's where I go. So most youth athletes, we figure what's the best athlete on the field at 7, 8 years old? With the athletes who's the most mature at that time, and that's based on he's more mature because he has more body control. He's stronger overall because he's progressing a little bit faster. Doesn't mean he's going to end up being the best athlete overall because then he might peak at puberty early, and then those athletes eventually catch up, and then the playing field begins to level off. But I really want them just to be able to learn to control themselves in space. So we do a lot of stability type exercises, isometrics, just learning, being able to engage and interact with the ground and controlling that trunk and torso. Because if your torso is not stable, you can't control your arms or legs. Therefore, you can't control where you are in space. So that's kind of the first thing that I begin to introduce those younger athletes to. It's just becoming grounded, torso and trunk stability, and body control. And then we have all types of games where we challenge them in a game scenario. For example, kids will get bored very quickly. We know that, but we want the stimulus to translate over to the field. I would take a young kid, and I haven't trained kids in so long, but I remember like it was yesterday. I would say, okay, we're doing linear sprints. When we get to a certain point, we're doing linear sprints. Now, how do I add a game time scenario to it? Just take them simple. Turn them in a circle 10 times, which now turns it into a game. Makes them dizzy. Now stay on the straight line when you run forward. Yeah, you have a blast doing it, but how many times you get turned around in a game where you got to re-recognize where you are, gain control, and then go back on a linear sprint? Then you add a color stimulus to it. Say, okay, I need you now to do the same thing, but I need you to run to the purple cone. I had all kinds of different cones. So now you got to run to the 45-degree angle. That's the same way of processing who's in front of you, changing angles and being able to pursue or try to separate from someone that's pursuing you. Just things that just make them really lock in and stay focused on concepts of what you're working on at that time. But body control was a big deal for me because once they can master their ability to control themselves, it then translates to them being able to do other things.
Now you say it's been a while since you worked with a lot of youth because as we see it, and then we know you've been in the industry for 30 plus years, and now you're working with a lot of high profile professional athletes, right? So these guys usually are coming in and they're the best of the best, right? But there also is always like something that you can diagnose that they need to get better at. What are like some main areas that you're seeing that your athletes come in with, I would say maybe a deficiency or they're struggling with that you're helping them improve on?
Everybody's so different. That's the one thing I love about it. But a lot of the common scenarios that I see are pelvic dysfunction, lack of spinal alignment, being able to be secured around that pelvis and that lumbar spine area. They don't have great control. They're not really even aware of it, and it's because of our lifestyle. We sit in chairs, we sit in cars. We don't have great mobility routines. I like to say motion is lotion. I took that for someone else, but it's true to what it means that if an athlete who doesn't move really loses connection with the body and being aware of the planes that he's supposed to move within. And most young athletes or most pros, when they come in, they've been so restricted to doing what they do that they really, anything outside of what they do doesn't really translate over to being healthy. Does that make sense? So being able to reverse engineer them into different patterns to find balance, which keeps them healthy and resilient, they begin to immediately feel better when we start restoring those functions back to just being a human being. So I approach it from a standpoint, I say you move well as a human being first, to moving well as an athlete, to moving well in specific to what you do. And that's how I break it down. Those three phases right from the beginning. As soon as you come in the door, we got to restore health. We got to move normal, just in day-to-day life of being comfortable within who you are. Then we work on, okay, let's get back to being an athlete. What are those fundamental movement patterns that you need to do most? If you're an athlete, let's say if you're a skill set player, like a wide receiver, you're constantly decelerating. So your ability to absorb impact, transfer forces becomes super important. Those tendons got to become resilient. Once you get good at some of those things, we begin to expand on that. Even, for example, max velocity. I look at max velocity as a vitamin for the team sport athlete. They're not hitting max speeds all the time, but they need to be exposed to those speeds. So when they do get a chance to hit them, they're healthy and confident that they can hit them without injury. Their tendons and their ligaments and their hamstrings and everything else around the pelvis has been exposed to that velocity over and built up over the course of the training window, so there's no fear there. And then they can get out there and play every single day and not be afraid of or be resilient enough to where they're comfortable and there's no neural guarding to get out there, hit the ground hard, change direction. You guys are athletes yourselves, and you're sensitive to what you're feeling, and you always want a strategy to problem solve those things that you're feeling that'll give you confidence going into game to game.
What does an onboarding process look for you like when an athlete comes to work with you? Whether let's say you don't know what sport they're playing, a needs analysis, like testing before you actually start working with them, or just like assessment before you start working with. Like, what does an onboarding process look like for an athlete that they work with you?
When we onboard, because there's a lot of things we look at, we don't do it all in one day. We kind of build it over the course of a week. And we integrate it with medical. So we're talking to our medical team about exactly who this athlete is and coming in and what their history is like, what they've been done. And it depends on if they're a veteran or they're a young guy coming from college. But it's kind of, we collect a lot of force plate data. And then we got to collect that force plate data, not just on a bilateral standpoint. We try to do it on a unilateral standpoint too, because we want to know what those weaknesses are up and down the chain. even from the ankle to the knee to the hip, what type of, depending on if it's a rotational type athlete, we try to make it specific to the goals of what they do, so we can find things that need to be balanced out on where they may have power leaks, where they're not generating force, and then more also trying to find out what type of force they are good at and where they're lacking to bucket them to exposures. So we want to expose them to their weaknesses in the training window as fast as possible, because our window of time is short when you have the opportunity to train with most athletes. You don't have them for the course of the calendar year. You have them for 6 weeks, 4 weeks, depending on what they come to you for. You have to pinpoint what the issue is immediately, begin and expose it, and then begin exposing them to that stimulus that's going to make the adaptation or move the needle towards the adaptation. We go over the course of the force plate data before. We do a little bit of on-field stuff, but most pro guys don't need to go out there and do 10-yard sprints and 40-yard sprints of that matter. They've been running. It's more if you can get through the physical aspects and then be at the physical aspects of what they're not doing well, problem solve that. It carries over to what they do on field pretty good. And we'll use some timing just in real time for a stimulus so they can have something they can feel, so they know where they are in regards to effort, so and intensity. And we use that over the training variables over the course of the time that we have them. So once we get those things together with the medical team, we sit down and kind of begin to plan. And a big thing for me is my prehab, because your prehab expands in the beginning early on within that first onboarding week to prep the athlete for what's to come in the training cycle. So it'll be wider, and then as we get closer to the actual training window, it begins to diminish and the training window expands. But then, and when we get back into in season, that prehab prep window expands, because then that's what's going to maintain all the things that we did in the training cycle to carry them over and maintain through the season, because that's where they're learning the most about their body and what they do well and what they don't do well.
What is a normal prehab routine look like for say if you take Justin Fields, right, high level quarterback? What would his prehab session look like? Just before, and then also when you're looking at in season, like what is that like?
The big thing that goes with rotary athletes is sequencing. So being able to maintain sequence, a lot of people stay away from doing anything rotary in season for rotational athletes. Yes, to me, yes and no. I definitely like to keep the body and the tendons strong using a ton of isometric spinning. I like using crane scales when utilizing those isometrics to give a number and a variable so the athlete can see what he's actually doing. And it also gives me an idea what the state of readiness is too as well. So I can see if that athlete's in fatigue state and then what I need to pull back on, because I might have a scheduled idea in my mind what I wanted that athlete to do over the course of his practice schedule and training throughout the week. Doesn't mean he's going to always, depending on the output of the game, be ready to do his strength training on a scheduled day. So I might have to move that to do something else. So it's a constant adjustment. It's not nothing that we stay locked in. We just try to move the big rocks to staying comfortable and healthy, as we find also what's going to be consistent for him the way he plays at his best, because everybody's different. Just because that's the program I have for you may not match up with the program that I have for him, because he might need a little bit more recovery days built in between his strength days. You might be a soldier where you can hit your strength days on point every off day within your schedule to stay consistent that way. So finding that balance of what your body responds to and what it needs to recover and regenerate over that 5-day, 6-day period you have between game to game. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is making sure his shoulders and structure stay stable and maintain good posture, because if shoulder girdle doesn't work well rotating if it's not aligned properly from a spinal alignment standpoint. Making sure his pelvis, internal, external rotation, and his pelvis, he has great pelvis control and everything's in sequence and he's utilizing the ground. And I have like a series of isometric anti-rotation exercises that reinforce a neural connection to the brain so they can stay within rhythm and sequence on a regular basis. So when they feel themselves getting out, they can isolate certain positions or certain, I would say, portions of that pattern to where they can feel themselves engaging with the ground and create the right timing coming through. Is at a slower speed to correct errors, and then they can pick it back up right at high velocity because they know exactly where they're going wrong.
Like that. I like that a lot. It's hard to say where you, because obviously it's over time, like you said before. Like you have to like trial and error for a lot of this to figure out like what methodologies works, and every athlete is different. But also like you're working with top guys, and also you're training guys, because a lot of guys over here in Europe don't know the difference in like what it's like to train people for the combine, and also train like as an NFL athlete that's just like working like just for their off season. What are the differences in those two, and what is like how tough is it on combine training that it's not really like you're not training for football?
Combine is very specific to a task, meaning I need to run fast. Shuttle's okay. Vertical jump gives a correlation of how much power output that's going to translate over to helping you run to give us an idea of what's occurring, how you apply forces, how well do you apply force horizontally, how well do you apply force vertically. I use those as metrics. I teach it, but I use those as metrics to translate over to the primary thing, which is running that 40-yard linear event. It's very, very specific. I've always looked at the combine as like everybody look good in shorts until you put the pads on, the game change. So if I get you comfortable in understanding how to sprint and how to master the 40, which is a variable in itself, and it's a strategy that you have to use to approach that, and then become consistent in it, and then you have to do it where you're being timed and measured so you know what it feels like, is more important to me than anything else. And making sure these guys are healthy enough to where they're onboarded properly, so when they peak at the right times, it matters the most. Because a lot of times you can peak too soon if you don't control those variables over the course of that 6 to 8 week window, because you have all these things built in. You have these bowl games, you got these all-star games, you got all these things happening intertwined with that 8 week period. So you may not have 8 weeks. You might have 4 or 5 weeks. And then if they go into those games, if you had them for 1 or 2 weeks for training and you start building towards the adaptation, then they go to this game for a week, they're set back. They might get hurt. They get beat up. So then we got to bring them back. So again, the big thing for me in training, and I'll talk about the difference between them and prepping an athlete that's already established, is understanding who that athlete is and then meeting them where they are based on what the goal is at that time. And then being specific, moving towards how to be successful for that goal matters. Intent, and I call that intent. I'm very intentful in recognizing what the need is and staying on task or keeping the main thing. And whatever things that get in the way of blocking that process or get in the way of derailing success, I'm problem solving it in real time immediately. So I'm big on always knowing how to regress, progress, make a lateral decision in real time, and problem solve as we program over the course of 8 weeks. To me, that's what makes a good coach. There is no such thing as a perfect program. It's looking at the scenario. I look at it as a math equation. I look at the scenario, I figure out where that athlete is at that time, and then I build it up. I build that program over the course of time that I have in that window. But I do realize I'm writing in pencil, because 9 times out of 10, based on his state of readiness and what's occurring, I'm going to change it. And I'm okay with that. I have fun with that. That's where the sweet spot is. That's what makes me different, I feel, more than anything else. I'm not rigid to what I originally create, because it's the recipe that I'm adjusting, and every recipe is different for every person I come in contact with. And that carries over to professional athletes and their injury histories, what they've been exposed to over the course of time. Who likes what? All athletes are different. Some people like the squat, some people hate the squat. Some dudes want to pick up heavyweight just to feel it because it makes them feel like a man. Some don't want to go near it. You got to first and foremost get into that person's head and know what they like and what they don't like, and then figure out what's the best stimulus and what's the best path to get there to help them as an individual. Because one thought process doesn't fit every athlete from a standpoint of how they approach their preparation to the game. And we're just trying to arm them and give them a routine so they feel comfortable and confident in themselves every single day. that they can get out there. Let's look at baseball, 162. Every single day, they got to make sure they get up, go out there, perform at a high level. Of course, that's damn near impossible because they're very streaky just from fatigue in itself. But if you got a routine that you can depend on, that's going to help prepare you, that you got confidence in, those streaky streaks or those slumps or whatever are short-lived because you have something that's going to restore you back into a relative harmony that you are always are looking for to build that consistency.
And you talk about like with your combine guys, because this is a huge thing, especially because we're over here in Europe, and a lot of these kids are trying to get ready for camps, combines, and all that stuff, and teaching them how to properly run 40s, because a lot of these that's the first time ever doing it. Could you break down like how you teach the technique of like running the 40? Because it's a huge question for a lot of these kids. Like some of them don't even know how to get in the stance. They don't know when they're supposed to like, or how to come out of the stance, like coming out like an airplane. Like some guys are from the stance, stand straight up, you know what I mean? And then try to run the 40, like where the acceleration is, where the power is coming from, like how much force production. You know what I mean? There's so many, like, should I be taking a big first step? Like, am I looking at trying to gain 3 yards in that first step, or is it like supposed to be a smaller step? Like all these different types of things that a lot of these kids have no clue about. And Jay and I are trying to, you know, change the way it's looked at over here. And there's the other coaches over here that are trying to teach it, but it's still an audience that hasn't really been touched over here.
I would say you have to figure out what the athlete's weaknesses and strengths are, and based on how they apply force from a physical aspect first. Are they strength deficient? What they're deficient in? Are they strength deficient? Are they velocity deficient? Are they power deficient? And then that way you can expose them again physically in the weight room to the things that they need work on the most. In regards to the technical model, in regards to on the field, I like short to long. I like to, as I'm building up to a longer program, to gradually build up exposures, like I said, to max velocity. I don't want to rush them into that realm, but being able to create horizontal force is a big thing for me. And a lot of times, athletes, if they can't do it, they're usually probably not strong enough. That's going to translate over into the weight room for that first step exposure. So being able to generate maximum amounts of force off a two-leg push, you have to try to simulate that velocity or that effort in the weight room to translate over to the field, and then choose exercises that can bridge the gap to set them up, being able to drop into those deeper angles to create that horizontal force, which is going to translate over to setting them up for that first 10 yards. Once you get comfortable within that, then you got to worry about, all right, I have to introduce concepts of transition. So once I get good at creating horizontal force, I'm building up that velocity early on. That velocity is going to hold me into the race where I could transition that speed over into max speed. Because you're not going to hit max speed that long in a 40. You're just not. It's more about how well you can begin to create horizontal force early on, than how you can transition that horizontal force as you're maintaining your posture and your torso to project yourself in the right direction. Getting good at concepts that create that. And I've always had better success in focusing on those two things before teaching them when to get upright. Because there is a certain time that you have to get up and let that speed transfer over, or that velocity and momentum transfer over into the back end of the run so you can hold it. But early on, you got to get started. You got to have a big enough engine just to create enough force before you can begin to think about transitioning over to max velocity, or begin to transition it over and turning it over to carry that velocity on the back end. So I'm a big horizontal force guy early on in the program, and it simplifies it because most athletes struggle in that, and that's why they can't get in the right positions with a stance and start, because they don't even have the mobility within their hips, which I told you earlier, around their pelvis, to even understand, or spinal flexibility and mobility, to even set their posture in their stance to load the ground to begin with. So you have to address those structures and address those issues before you even introduce the stance, because the stance will never feel comfortable until they improve upon it. And it's something that you just slowly, gradually introduce over the course of the weeks that you have them. But you keep it simple in your approach. Don't do too much too soon. Stay with that horizontal implement early on, addressing those mobility issues, getting in and out of that stance, and then building on your transitions as you go.
You gotta look like kind of like and addressing deficiencies that, and honestly outside of the combine, but you have athletes that may come in and they may be strength deficit. There may be a strength deficit for them, or you may see a deficit with regards to deficiencies with strength, or you may see deficiencies with max velocity with certain athletes and certain archetypes, whether, you have bigs will probably have obviously max velocity deficiencies, and, maybe certain positions that have strength deficiencies. Just like when how do you usually go about assessing athletes and their archetype, and what do you usually do to kind of like address those deficiencies?
Force play data tells me everything early on about what type of apologies for the background. Force play data is what I going early on to give me an idea of what type of force that athlete applies. Where are those deficiencies showing up at? And that'll kind of begin to start setting the stage and what direction I want to put them in or what I want to introduce them to majority of the time over the course of the week. So once I identify, and usually that's going to give me an idea of what the technical model is as well. Sometimes I do have special type scenarios where if people are uncomfortable in dealing with the force plate, their numbers will be skewed. Because then what you see on the force plate, then you go out and you look at your technical model and you watch them run it, and they're like, oh, this is not matching up. Because I have to begin science, I use it as a guide. I don't depend on it. I use it to help me make decisions, but I trust myself because I've been around long enough based on what I see, and then I begin to see if things correlate and match up based on what the numbers are telling me. And if I see something in that scenario, then I'll go back and I'm like, okay, this force play data is not accurate, but I can see these deficiencies on the field. I'm going to lean towards what I see with the technical model than I am on the physical model. But most of the time, the force play data will give me a direction on how I want to approach it on field. So if his force is good and his power numbers are, then we're going to focus more on transition. If his force is bad, most likely he's going to because we're all good at something. So whether it's just creating velocity or being reactive off the ground, or whether it's being powerful or whether it's being just strong, being able to create massive amounts of force. If an athlete does really good in creating massive amounts of force, then I'll focus more on power and max velocity. If an athlete is velocity deficient and his numbers skew where he needs more force, then we'll focus on more stance and starts, 10 yards, things of that magnitude. If his power, where he's not transitioning that power, if he's not staying continuous, if he's not explosive enough to continually build on that force, then we'll spend a lot of time in that transitional stage, which I consider power. So these athletes, when we're getting on the field throughout the week, might have 2 sessions of short sprints or short acceleration because that's where they're force deficient, and 1 at max velocity. They might have 2 of power, or they might have 2 of max velocity based on what the exposure is. So once I identify that based off of the force play data, based off the visual technical model I see and I get from some of the timing gates and things of that magnitude, I'll begin to put them in those buckets and put them in those areas where they fit best, so they can get exposures to that more often, so they can work on getting better at that concept. And I'll do the same thing in the weight room. I'll do the same thing in regards to if he's velocity deficient, if he's reactive, which tells me he's not as reactive as he needs to be. We'll spend more time on our lower body days doing reactive elements that create more spring and balance. Mm-hmm. Same thing with force. I've come up with some horizontal force concepts as I like being in tempo towards the stimulus. I'll try to find ways to put them in a position to where they have to create horizontal force with the lower extremities to project the torso in the right direction. You can do plenty of things with bands in the weight room just to create that scenario. I'll do the normal stuff, but I want them to feel what that shin drop is. Dropping that front knee in front of that toe, getting that hip out in front of that knee to project the torso out. I want them to expose them to that as much as I can so they can become comfortable. A lot of times athletes may not get to the deeper angles that they need to be because they just don't know what it feels like. So the more you can get them introduced to how things feel, the better mental connection or that neural connection it can create, because it's all about feel. Because if you think in your body's slow, cloudy mind is a slow body. You want everything to come from a feel. So getting them exposures to how those things translate and what it feels like is the big thing in the weight room, which creates transfer over to the field.
Sorry, quick question. You guys do a non-counter movement and counter movement on the field? Or just
non-counter movement. We do non-counter movement and counter movement. We look at non-counter movement as starting strength. Counter movement is more power.
You guys look at the difference, like maybe
We look
the
at with difference, and we're seeing how fast they're applying, not just how much force they're applying, how fast they're applying that force. In power movement, we're looking at breaking force. We're looking at everything just to see how it correlates, and then we can see where the trends point us, and then that's kind of when we'll make our decisions of what we expose them to. And we have a list of exercise progressions that we take the athlete through that just help build. Some adapt faster than others, but what I try to do is I look at the root cause on why it might not be transferring from a standpoint, from a technical model, or even sometimes from a physical model. Little adjustments in position make the big difference. So why athlete may not, or if there's some kind of structural issue, whether that's mobility or stability, or just lack of just efficiency with the movement patterns, being able to become better, every opportunity you get to expose them to that stimulus that they're trying to adapt to helps you get them gets it better, helps you get them to a position where they can move faster to demonstrating the right stuff on the field. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. That's what matters the most. So I'm not afraid to be creative. I'm not afraid to experiment because I don't care about being creative from a sexy standpoint. I look at being creative to solve the problem. So we're all scientists. So we shouldn't restrict ourselves and stay so locked in on what this guy said to do or what this reading said do, because you might come up with something that contributes to the industry based on your own concept or that athlete and trying to get them to overcome the issue that you're trying to problem solve. You got to be able to be comfortable with that. And I see a lot of people are so afraid to get something wrong, but shoot, that's the only way you learn. You learn whether I add it to my repertoire or I take it out and throw it away. That was trash. But the athlete don't know. But you being true to yourself because you're approaching it with the right intent because you want that athlete to be successful. And you're willing to do anything and everything that within the principles behind why you make your decisions to help those things translate over.
What does your team look like? You said you have a medical team. It sounds like you have like a sports science team.
Yeah, I have a sports science team. Young man that's been with me for about 7, 8 years. He actually did his master's degree over in Europe. I just don't remember where. One of the sporting institutes over there, at least sharp. I have different doctors that I work with in Florida. Depending on what the issue is, I send them to either get orthopedic exams and like 3 of those doctors or even treatment. These doctors fly around also to see these guys in season as well. And we try to create familiarity with these guys because we don't want our athletes really jumping from place to place to place because it interferes with the ability to keep consistency within the routine. We want them to lock in with familiar people that they trust, and that trust factor matters. When the athlete believes in what you're doing, he can communicate to you what he's experiencing a lot better. Versus if he's unsure of what he's feeling, he's going to be a little guarded in explaining to him because he's not going to think you're going to understand him. He's going to be a little guarded in trying to tell you exactly what doesn't feel well versus what feels well. It should be a great conversation because it takes both athlete and coach to really come up with the best program because the feedback matters. And you're not going to get that feedback that you want if there's not the trust there and belief in what you're doing to where you're approaching it as a team. Because his career, his body is the vehicle that's transitioning over to success, which at the end of the day is what's making him money. So he has to be a part of that equation within at the pro level in the decision making. Then when you have that variable, it becomes very, very slow in building towards consistency because that's really what we're all striving to be the same and produce every single game.
So being a creator and being a scientist, how did Lila come about? Like, how did you? What is Lila all about?
It's funny because led right into that very well. I've always been looking for things, again, not to be sexy, but I've always felt like we put limitations on the training variable. You're looking at, I come from a time where everything was strength. If there was an issue, he needs to get stronger. His hips aren't mobile. He needs to squat deeper. I mean, it was always weight room, put the weight on your back. That's what it was. Then it changed. Then went to the stages where everything was bands, everything was resistance, everything was bands, and everything was sleds. The industry goes through phases, but nothing really gets, if you look at the force velocity curve on Those things all have a place within the force velocity curve and the training window. Remember, I told you my training focus is train well as a human being, train well as an athlete, train well specific to whatever sport that you play. So those variables fit up and down the force velocity curve. You can fit the force velocity curve right over that. At the higher end, though, we were always limited to what we can do at that peaking phase of what you do, because we're moving at such high speeds and making decisions in real time that we don't want anything to restrict us or slow us down. So it impacts the body from a movement standpoint with lighter loads. Even when we got from heavy sleds to now we only doing any sleds with more than 10% body weight. We went through that very well. It's still restricted positions that you need to be in to create max velocities and mechanics. So when Leela came about, and even weight vests shift on you, they're uncomfortable. You can't, it's tough to progress the lows, etc. It gave you weight on your center mass, but it didn't help you problem solve from a pattern standpoint and had that neural connection to the brain. So when I saw Leela, I started understanding the things that the messaging Joe was trying to impart on everybody. Was saying that this tool started out as a wave vest, but then he had the same thoughts that if I can connect and create a neural connection to the human body itself, and I can problem solving things in real time based on patterns, because to me, the human body and movement specific patterns is really the key to problem solving in sports and understanding those patterns. So if you're limited in understanding movement patterns, you're going to be limited in your programming for the athlete. You have to understand the human body and how it moves overall. So Leela is a tool that helps you problem solve or introduce patterns at the peak side of the force velocity curve at high speeds without interfering with the patterns in real time. So you still can micro progress loads and gradually build tolerance from beginning to end in that further phase of the force velocity curve, unlike any other aspect that we've ever been able to do. And it's new. So we're still learning how to maximize it and then give people a pathway of how to use the tool correctly. Because right now people are just buying it, but they have no idea on how to use it because, quite frankly, we're still developing it. And to me, it's how we're going to train the future. There's so many things that's to come with it. It's going to be a metric added to it, so you can measure joint speeds, and then the versatility in regards to if I want to be able to impact a throwing athlete, because to me, weighted balls puts too much stress on the shoulder at the release point of throwing a weighted implement at the end of the hand. It doesn't put the stress at the joint in the movement pattern that we're trying to create or the speed we're trying to impact at that joint. But if there's a tool that can load that joint in the direction I want that shoulder to rotate or build strength against where I want it to rotate, but it's impacting the joint only and not putting stress at the release point, then now I'm doing something that's never been done before. And if I want to work on deceleration, let's look at the pattern of deceleration. I can isolate how deceleration occurs in real time on the field at high speeds, load that pattern within the body. Now I'm carrying a weight into the field, but I'm not impacting the dynamics of the movement from a standpoint where it's interfering with that athlete as they change speeds or as they slow down. They can still just work on the concept and they can stay locked in from a neural standpoint. And they're not even aware it's there until they take it off. And they're like, wow. Then that's an immediate transfer. And that I come from a time to where contrast training was looked upon as if not real. Because contrast training has been around a lot, but now it's respected. We gave it a name, PAP. But I come from a time to where they was like, oh, there's no scientific proof that works. Now it's all, they name it and they act like they never discredited it, but at one point they did. That's what you're going to get. But then the body builds on that. Because I have noticed that you have to be very specific of when you pull it off, and you have to be very conscientious to how much volume, because to maximize the stimulus of having it loaded and unloaded, your window's small. And then you got to cut the workout right then and there. Because then athletes have a tendency to want to do more. Because when they feel it and they feeling good and they hit rhythms, coach, let me get another rep. They're looking for that perfect rep. There is no perfect rep. It's just consistency over time. Keep building consistency. Let's get better week to week. You're not going to accomplish everything in that one workout. And as long as we're going forward and getting better, that's what matters. Cut the workout. So I don't want to see your times drop. I want to build on it so you remember that stimulus and that feeling over the course of and be excited to approach the next workout because you know what's to come based on the experience that you just had, which was positive. Using that tool in that round, there's nothing like it. There is nothing like it.
So how is the technology adding resistance and whatnot? Because I've seen everything that like you put on and whatnot, but how does the technology add resistance or add that weight in there? And then what are you measuring in that when they're on it and when they're off of it? So what are the metrics that you're using?
That's what the metrics that's coming, what they're going to build within the tool is going to be really exciting because it'll spit these numbers out, but they haven't released that yet. But right now we use the same metric. You say, let's say 10-yard sprints. We're looking at 10-yard sprints. We're looking at 10 yards loaded, and we're documenting it. We have a certain amount of volume that we allow the athlete to utilize when they're loaded with Leland. Let's say it's an acceleration pattern. So an acceleration pattern will load the front end of the body, we'll load the front shin for that shin, that impact in the ground. Then we'll load the quad and the hip flexor depending on, because you can load distal and proximal. If you load further away, it's more load. If you load closer to the joint, it's less load. So you can progress just on how you load the body. And if you see any core stability issues and you want to get the core to become more stable, you can load that too. But just say if you're just loading lower extremity only, you can just start with the quad in the front and the front shin and around the hip flexor to keep everything front side. And then attacking that ground in that horizontal accelerated pattern. You introduce those loads gradually over time before you start light and gradually go over. Increase those loads over the course of 8 weeks, so to speak, the time that you have. And then even before we even start loading patterns, we load the vertical drills and the concepts of our prehab and our warm-up. So before we start loading the actual event, again, to build tolerance and to kind of gain a neural connection of recognizing and getting comfortable with the weight on or with the change, because you just don't want to abruptly put something on that's new and then get out there and start sprinting. You gradually build it up. And the same thing with max velocity. We have a posterior chain load for max velocity. So you got anterior for horizontal acceleration, you got posterior for max velocity. You do your high speed reps, you do your prep reps, your vertical drills, etc., your build up runs at the time, or your max velocity runs, or your flying tens, or you do your first few reps loaded, you give adequate rest, you unload, you're done. Do your time again, you're out, because you want to take advantage of the contrast, but your window is small. So I can do maybe 2 to 4 reps tops at high speeds with it. Then I take it off and I hit another 2 to 4 reps that's needed because if I PR, done. So as soon as I take it off, I hit that high speed, I'm done. I'm not doing any more because I want to prep you for the next one that comes, the next session that we have. And remember, some people, if it's a weakness, we're going to get 2 exposures in that week anyway. So it's not like they got to wait a whole full week, because remember, we're exposing them to that weakness in real time multiple times a week, because that's what we've identified.
What is the load?
How tough is it?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
What is the load of the wearable resistance?
It varies. It can go from 100 grams to 300 grams. So we might start with 100 grams in each spot, very light. Again, in the vertical drills concept of just getting used to being able to do prep drills to prepare for the session to come, and then take it off. And then the next couple, we might do that for 2 sessions, and then we'll get into the primary session to where we'll start actually adding a load to the stimulus or to the goal or to the event. If it's acceleration, we'll actually add it to that pattern. And then we might say that first week we'll stay at 100 grams at each area. That next week we micro progress, we'll go a little heavier. And then we'll actually go from, remember, it's proximal to distal, where if you're loading the joint, move a little bit further away, create more stress on the joint and more challenge, to challenge that area, which makes it stay impacted longer through that airtime management or that limb exchange, that switch in real speeds at high velocities. Because you get further away from the joint, the more stress is going to be. I'm hoping I'm getting that right. You guys understanding where I'm going with it?
No, I mean, yeah, from proximal
sure.
like so that's that's progressive. So you guys probably go from. So how do you progress the load in contrast to the proximal to distal? You guys
So
go.
you start closer to the joint and then move gradually away from the joint.
Well, yeah, I got that, but like, so do you guys kind of like cycle back? So going from, let's say you start at have 100 grams, and then you'll progress from proximal to distal, and then you'll go to the other side. So will you like increase the load and go back to proximal? Maybe go back to 100.
So before you increase, you'll increase the loads at that area. So you'll go through your process of and that's all individual choice. I like to load the area and then increase the loads at that area. And then the next progression for me is a smaller load, the bigger load, and add a smaller load.
Gotcha.
You see what I'm saying? So I built it that way now.
You probably range as proximal as you can to that joint, 100 to 300, max it out, whatever, and then get a little bit more distal. What are those? What are the increments? From
100, 200, 300.
What are the
so
proximal to
so I'll go. I can work my way up to 300, and it depends on the size of the athlete too, because you got a big 100 grams ain't gonna do nothing for him.
Yeah,
because that's a big thigh. You know what I'm saying? So you got a big fella, you got to put some load on there. You know, so we might start with 300 grams for him. So it's all shapes and sizes that matter. That's what makes the tool so unique, because you can make it specific to the body type, the position, the strength levels, the size. The pattern issue. If a person doesn't get good front side flexion on his right side, you can load that side to create more of a stimulus. That way it's a neural connection where he's aggressively attacking with his right leg to get front side, because it's almost like your hand is there on his thigh reminding him to drive that hip and knee forward. So you can create whatever you want to problem solve the issue in real time, which is why I love it, again, at high velocities without impacting the technical model whatsoever. It just translates over.
That is awesome. What do you call it? Just like a two-part question. So with regards to going back to the proximal to distal part, you guys, how does that look like with a measurement standpoint? So it's just like, okay, this is proximal and this is distal. When you go from proximal to distal, is it automatic from here to here, or is it incremental? And if it is,
it's incremental. It's incremental. You put that there based on what you see that gives the best output. So if an athlete, if you load the hip, if you feel like his hip flexors are weak, or he just doesn't have a good awareness of where his pelvis is, then you want to load that front side. Then if you put it higher and you see it's there, but it's not where you want, drop it a little bit more, and then see if that gives you the right stimulus, then you know exactly where you want to load for that individual. So it's always an adjustment.
Is it like inches? Do you know how many inches?
You can do inches. You can do inches. You can do 3 to 4 inches. You can drop. I'll start right at the hip, and then I might drop 3 or 4 inches down, 3 or 4 inches down. So you can break in your own mind. That's the beautiful thing about the product, the versatility and flexibility to make decisions to progress it based on who that athlete is.
Yeah, stuff.
And that's return to play protocol. Great. Like Sam says, one thing that I love, that he says speed should be a part of GPP. It's a fundamental. Linear speed is fundamental. It becomes specific when it's in a team sport environment. You should be progressing loads on the front in that early stage of development anyway. So it should just be a natural instinct to build the pattern correctly so the athlete moves well. And that's kind of how I look at it now and approach it, is I start in my early move well as a human being, return to play protocol, and I load basic movement patterns. And then I load velocity patterns when I get to that fundamental stage. Because that foundation stage is move well as a human being. That fundamental stage is move well as an athlete. I'm sprinting with fundamentally in moving well as an athlete before I get specific. The specific now, I've actually taken Leela and I've broken it down from asymmetrical standpoint to really focus on individual weaknesses or pattern-specific deceleration and high speed. So you can use it doing football-specific drills. You can use it doing baseball-specific drills. You can use it doing hitting drills. You can use it in real time once you get to that specific phase. So you can use it in all 3 phases of development in my program, because I try to keep things in 3, and that's from a spiritual standpoint. 3s became easy for me, and that's how I try to approach it now.
So when the guys take this thing off, and you have them hit a PB, or they get as close as they can to it, and you cut them off, how hard is it to for guys to no closer, I want to see if I get faster? How hard is it to get them to understand that's it, bro?
Man.
She said, oh man.
I have 2 sides. I got the nice side where I'm the loving, the dad type guy, and then I'm the butthole where I can be like, man, go sit your ass down. I'm done. They're done. When they see that side come out, they be like, all right, I'm good. So I just, you get excited about wanting to see people want to get better, but when they feel it, because you can see the body language, you can see the interaction with the coach, or the interaction with the lesson, with the focus of what we're working toward, that the excitement to want to do another rep because that rep felt good is meaning that tells you that you're progressing in the right direction. You make your notes, as I make notes after every session. I've always, for the last 20 years, I got papers from just the notes that I write about every athlete, every session. So I know exactly what that experience, positive or negative. If it's negative and I need to do something different. If it's positive, okay, let's build on that. Let's keep layering it. Let's pick up the things that really work well. Let's take the things that didn't work well, take them out so we can really get to success of what we're trying to accomplish a whole lot faster. Minimize that time because your windows are so small.
That's also a tough thing for a lot of coaches to like know when to like cut an athlete off, and like because sometimes coaches also want to see that PR if they can hit it again or if they can get a little bit faster, and knowing when it's too much.
When you PR, it's already done. You want that from a standpoint psychologically. You want him to remember that feeling, and you want him to replay that in his brain over and over again. Body doesn't know the difference between a mental and a physical rep. I can get 1,000 mental reps off that feeling and just reduplicate that and come out with the effort to want to do it again, and builds excitement. But you keep the body in harmony because we've realized that state of readiness matters, and doing too much, you can lose the adaptation that you created, and now you're causing confusion because now he's struggling. I had that, and he's frustrated. So you just blew the entire session because you just did too much. Where you just should have just put your hands in your pocket and said, enough, we're done. We had a good session today.
And this question right here comes in from one of our parent listeners, and is, how do you know when their athlete as a child, or maybe even as they're in the high school level, has what it takes to become pro, like go pro?
You see, it's a great question. I have my last crop of kids that I've had that were like 6 or 7 years old coming through. It's a young man that's at USC. I won't say his name. He's a safety. He was at Ohio State, transferred over when some of the staff members left. He had, since he was 6 years old, he's been a dog. And it's an ability to be fearless in what he does. And he does everything the same way all the time. Does that make sense? He does. It's a saying, and I can't remember it right now. Do all things. What it says, do all things, do everything. I can't remember the saying right now. I just discussed it with my son the other day. We were talking about it. But everything is the same from the standpoint of how he approaches detail, consistency, intensity. It's all the same. It never changes. And he's been like that since he was 6 years old. He wants to do things right. He does it with great intensity. It translates over to the field, that same mindset, to his training, to everything he does. If you see an athlete that has some gifts now, that he naturally moves well as an athlete, but I've also seen guys work towards becoming really good athletes that have that same gift. But that teaching discipline and consistency at an early age, it's not about what you feel and how you feel. It's about what the goal is and working towards that. If they find to that early, and that's tough in today's stages because we're the most distracted generation in the history of in the history of the world. So to really get somebody to lock in that discipline early on is a challenge. And you have to control that as a parent and what you introduce them to and what you allow them to spend time participating in regards to, you got to monitor how much time they spend on the internet. You got to monitor what you're doing day to day after school. How do you go about your post activities when you get home from school? And if you're serious about participating in a sport, that athlete needs guidance. There's no such thing as letting him make the decisions because their brain, the capacities of their brain to process and make decisions is not developed enough. So leaving a 7 or 8 year old, leaving it up to him to make decisions is just crazy to me. You have to give them guidance if they're really serious about it. And I've been fortunate, all my children are D1 athletes, or better. It was because I set those structures in place about, if you want to do this, I told them, you're going to be good at whatever. Anything you said, we're going to have something that you're going to work towards. Meaning, if you want to be the best athlete, that's great. If you want to be the best writer, that's great. If you want to be the best hamburger maker. That's great. We're going to work at it. And we're going to develop a routine, like I always talk about, is to stay consistently and working towards that goal to become the best at that each and every single day. We're going to build it in our day-to-day routine. We have our time to where we're having fun and enjoying ourselves, but if you get your tasks done within a window, you'll have more free time to do the things that you enjoy. If you can build those disciplines early, they got plenty of time to develop, because unbeknowingly, you're laying a foundation to when they hit puberty, you've already established half the battle, which is introducing their bodies to what it needs to mature and develop towards. Just from the type of muscle fibers you develop, if you're playing a sprinter or a fast twitch type sport like football, that's used football, if those athletes are introduced early on pre-puberty, when he gets to that maturity aspect, he'll get more muscle fibers developing towards that concept. So you get an athlete that becomes twitchy and explosive and dynamic because you introduce them to those stimulus and build consistency early on when they were young.
I mean, that honestly sounds exactly how, and I never really understood it until like I got older, why my dad was so strict on being consistent with, the schedules and times of what you show up to things and how hard you work towards it. Like there's no, like my dad's favorite thing was like, you'll never half-ass things. Like whatever you're going to do, you're going to give it your full effort. Right. And that was like pertaining to whether I was mowing the lawn or I was going to a football game. Like it was consistency with like everything that I did with stuff. So it's super important to hear that from a coach, a parent, and then like for our youth athletes, like, hey guys, like start developing that consistency now. Like if you want to make it to this level, because realistically, because we're on the European side, and we grew up in America, but the percentages are so slim when you going from high school, trying to make it to the college level, whether it's D1, D2, D3, and then trying to go from there to making it to the professional level is even smaller. So if you haven't built up those habits of what the other guys are already doing before that, is not going to work. So
no, not at all. Not at all. You can be shell shocked when you get to the next level. You can get overmatched because you haven't been preparing and exposing yourself to that level. And even in competition, making sure you get your athletes safe, you start building those routines out. The level of competition matters, because if you're not exposing that athlete to the most challenging environments possible, he's not going to be ready, because there's going to be other athletes that's just as good as he is eventually, and everybody's talented. How do you deal with that? How do you overcome adversity? We started around the hood. I grew up in the hood in Baltimore. It was like, shoot, in order to beat a man, you got to beat the man. You should embrace that. Somebody hit you, you should be like, did he hit me that hard? Okay, I'm coming back. I might get a penalty because I'm going back to hit him again because I want to see if that was real. But that's that competitive fire that you want, because you really see it. If he beat me, I got to either two things. I got to go and compete with him again, or I got to go back and get better. And I know that, and I should be excited about that. So adversity is a good thing, and you become bulletproof to it. So when you get into those challenges, at high-level sports, we're always going to be challenged. And it's hard to stay consistent. But it's all on the mindset on how you approach it. Have you been exposed to that early enough to be able to compete and stay mentally strong? A lot of our youth aren't strong anymore like that. They're not being challenged enough. And a lot of them, quite honestly, it's going to be very few that make it because just they're too comfortable. And we've become soft as a society. I can go on for hours about this topic. You can see.
Oh, we low because it's the same thing we experience over here. Because I mean, like you said, like for our American athletes, it started early on, right? The sports are in school and everything like that. But we're over here in Europe where it's at the club level, right? So for them, it's a lot different to what they're exposed to. And then like we come from, like you have to work really hard to get a scholarship to be able to go to college. Like I remember hearing it very early on, like, hey, like you're either going to get a scholarship or you're going to join the military, right? You got one of those two options. But athletes over here is a little bit different. I mean, they don't have to worry about making it in sports because schooling is free or it's not as expensive as what it is in the States. You also have a lot more backing by the government over here. Like you have free healthcare and all. So there's not much of like, I would say not a need or a hustle or a grind to like get to that point of making it to the top, because there is no downfall if you don't. Right? For us, like if you didn't do that, like what are you gonna do? So like I think that like bringing our American mindsets over here has helped us a lot with working with a lot of these athletes, but it's still a huge gap between Europeans to Americans, but then even in America, like the gap is also getting bigger on like coaches like yourself, preaching that consistency and working hard and getting to because these kids nowadays have access to everything, right? It's all fast paced. It's how quickly can I get to the end goal without enjoying the process of getting there, and that's what's scary to see, especially for us coaches, because we know that the process of being really fast, like genetics are genetics, right? But the process of being really fast and getting really strong takes time. Like there is a process to it all, but kids don't enjoy it that much anymore.
No, they don't, because they're distracted. Right? They have other things that interest them. They're so visually stimulated, and it's easy to just sit down and be intoxicated with the screen and swipe or play video games all day long. You look up, it's 10, 12 hours. You can play video games all day. You eat, you drink, you play. There's no more. Let's go outside and play. And that's a cliche. No one wants to hear it anymore, but it's the reality. You get better because you stay active. Bottom line, point blank. We played multiple sports. We took a badge of honor to play every sport. One of the first things a young athlete should be doing is playing everything, developing multiple skill sets across the board. Everything. I don't care if it's swimming, gymnastics, basketball, baseball. It should be training everything just to move on multiple planes, developing athleticism. How much of that time the parents don't want to really even travel around, because the parents don't want to sacrifice that time. So shoot, I never was home, man. I was every day. We were homework. We out and about. Practice. This person had practice here. This person had practice there. I'm going from practice to practice. And then there was no off season. You go from one sport to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's how the athleticism overall was developed. One kid we're talking about right now has, he's 4 years old. He's going into year 9 with the Dolphins. This dude, AAU basketball, AAU track and field, national champion, triple jump. These dudes, football, they played multiple sports. So it was all about being an athlete was the key. That's what the hobby was. We don't get that anymore. We get one sport, and that might be it. And they play that one sport their entire lives. So they get good at that skill, but they aren't good at being an athlete. And the athlete is what powers the skill. Remember that. The athlete powers the skill, not vice versa. And we flipped it. We think in the skill set and become so specific to the skill set, we get really, really good at the skill set, but then also there's a price with that, because then you get a bunch of early injuries that occur at 12 years old that shouldn't be happening until you're 30, just from overuse patterns.
What would be your best piece of advice for coaches that are getting started in this industry to find success?
Understand what matters most in regards to that makes us be considered a good coach. First and foremost, if it makes you feel good, then it matters. Not what other people think about the decisions that you make, because you're making your decisions based on the athlete and his best interests. A lot of times we make our decisions and we're looking at to see who's watching and see if they're going to actually tip the cap that was a great job. So depend on your validity and believing in yourself and how you make your decisions based on the principles that you created around yourself within that decision making. Don't be afraid to build your own concepts, your own programming, but you have to have an understanding of how the human body works. Don't just be a follower of someone else's program. And the reason why you're doing that, because you have no principles in place to govern yourself. What are your principles that you created and put in place that ensures you or polices you within your decision making? You got to start with that. You're not all these modalities. I use Leela, but I'm not Leela. I use kettlebells, I'm not a kettlebell guy. It doesn't matter to what I use to solve the problem. I'm just solving the problem. And I have principles in place to guide me along that process to make the right decisions pertaining to that athlete.
Go.
That's it right there. That's yeah, for sure. Coach, we got a last segment of the day, though. We got our 90-second round. 1-word answers, right? It's going to be 10 random questions that go all across the board. Don't be scared. It'll be all right, bro.
No.
So
I ain't never scared.
All right, bet. Just making sure. So 90 seconds. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. So first, favorite post-workout snack?
It's a protein cookie that I like. I can't think of the name of it, but it's a protein cookie. It's great.
Is best speed tracking equipment in the industry?
I'm old. Robert timing system.
Favorite NFL team?
Ravens. Baltimore. All day.
Pizza or burger?
Burger.
Top athlete you've ever trained.
Track and field female athlete.
Best gym you've ever been to.
House of Athlete.
Hey,
Best coach in the industry.
One of my favorites, Les Spellman.
Would you rather be in a ring with a gorilla, tiger, or a bear?
Gorilla.
Best state in America.
Baltimore. Maryland.
And that is it. I had to throw that one in there. I knew he was going to say, the B-boy boys always hold it down. Coach, we appreciate you coming on. Thank you for being here today with us, man. There's so much knowledge that we learned from you today. Can't wait to drop this episode.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm grateful and I'm honored for the opportunity, man. Enjoy what you guys are doing. Keep it going. Whatever I need to do to help you get the word out, please just let me know. I'm here for you. It's good to see young brothers in the industry wanting to carry it to another level. I applaud that, man. I do. I'm all behind you.
appreciate that.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciate it.
And that's the day.
No problem.